Welcome to the next chapter on, now this time we're talking about a lot of different things. We're going to go with observational studies, design studies, surveys, kind of some of the stats that you see in real life. And this happens to be an election year right now. So we are being inundated with crazy polling results and things like that. So I'll throw some of those in there. So for those of you that are watching, welcome to the inside of my hotel room. I'm chaperoning a high school trip to Disney, and I'm in my hotel room making a video for you. That's how dedicated I am. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is kind of go through some of this beginning stuff with sampling and surveys. We're going to start with sampling and surveys, and then get to experiments, and then a little bit more about why. But let me, before I say anything else, samplings and surveys, we've got designed experiments. This is a new program here that I'm working with, so we'll see. I can't spell designed. Not sure why that's doing that. Designed experiments. I'm going to make that a little bit smaller there, easier to see. And observational studies. Trust me, that first letter is an O. So observational studies. All right, designed experiments are only allowed to, or is the only way that we can show cause effect. All right, that's the only way we can do cause effect. Observational studies is how we show nothing more than an association. A relationship exists. In history, there have been a lot of things that people have looked at and said, look at this, what's going on. And they say cause effect, but what they're really doing is they're just looking at something that's going on and they're noticing an association. And you turn on your evening, like late night, okay, maybe not super late night unless you're watching this really late at night. TV commercials, infomercials, and they'll try to sell you anything, and they'll say, hey, wearing this or doing this seems to improve people's attitudes, their behaviors, how they feel, how they respond to pain. And those are observational studies, not a designed experiment. An observational study also would be looking at some things in the past. They've looked and said, wow, look, red wine seems to reduce the risk of heart disease. And that's only something they looked at in terms of an observational, they observed this effect. Wow, all these people tend to drink red wine about a glass a day. They all have a lower heart disease rate. Must be something going on. Well, what they noticed was going on was something that we'll call common response later. What we assume to be common response, that is, people who can afford a glass of red wine every day also probably have a little bit more money to spend on healthcare, and then probably have a lower risk of heart disease. So that's an observational study. They later actually went on and did some designed experiments and tested to see, if they controlled every other aspect of the experiment, could they get a result? And they actually found that, yeah, there are certain aspects of red wine that do help with prevent heart disease and heart disease. All right. So now what we're going to do in terms of talking about surveys first. First, we got to talk about what a population is and what a sample is. Now, when I say population, I'm not talking about like everybody in the whole world population. I'm talking, well, what are we referring to? So in this current election year, many of the samples that they're doing, they're talking to people who are likely voters. So when they make phone calls and they do phone call things, they're talking to people, are you likely voters? So somehow they've either indicated in some past thing that they're a likely voter, or they call a bunch of people. They say, hey, are you likely to vote in the upcoming election? If they say yes, then they keep talking to them. If they say no, they don't want to know what those people think about the election. So my population would be likely voters. Okay? And then what they do is then they ask them a series of questions. All right, and the people that they talk to, that's the sample. So it's a select group of the population. And there are a lot of ways to get a sample. And we'll talk about some of those different ways. And I'll just say right here at the beginning, and I don't want to steal my own thunder later, but the very best way to do any type of sampling is what's called a simple random sample. A simple random sample is just that. It's a random, that means, so random means there's a method by which people are selected that is uncontrolled. So it's a random process, and there's ways that we'll do that, and I'll show you later. Sample, because it's of a population. Simple, this is what a lot of people forget, and I really want to emphasize this. A simple random sample means that simple means everybody in the population has an equally likely chance of being selected through this random process. All right, so once again, simple means everybody in the population has an equally likely chance of being selected for the sample. If we're ever doing a problem and you realize, wait, some people can't be selected, or I do something and now that excludes other people from being selected, then it's not a simple random sample. It could be a different type of random sample. So let's look at a couple different types of random samples. Random sampling techniques that we can use is what's called convenience. And lucky for us, that is exactly what it means. If you go outside the classroom door or go outside your home front door and you talk to the first 10 people you see, that's a convenience sample because it's convenient. You're likely going to get responses that are inconsistent with the overall general population because you're only talking to people who are there that particular time. If you're out in the front of the school in the morning to do a sample, you're only going to get people who show up during the timeline that you give them. I mean, some of you don't show up till 8:02. You should be here earlier, but some of you don't. Therefore, you're not going to get a chance to sample people who show up late. And maybe, are there people who consistently show up late? We all know there are. Or early, like me. So a convenient sample is just that, choosing individuals who are easiest to get to, not a good way. All right. Voluntary response. Then we're going to talk about types of bias. I'll come back to this in a second as we come through other types of sampling techniques. But one things that show up when we do bad sampling techniques is we get things that are called bias. Bias is a big word here, systematic. But it's a method that systematically favors or systematically benefits a certain part of or a certain subset of the population. Some of you remember Dewey Truman. Dewey wins. It's in history. Look it up. But Truman actually won. But the headline said Dewey wins because their method for doing sampling was so biased towards people who supported Dewey that when they talked to people on telephones, they're like, oh, everybody wants Dewey. No doubt about it. So they were predicting it before the election actually even ended. Truman won. What was the problem? Their method of sampling was so biased towards people who supported Dewey. Now, if memory serves me correctly, and you can check me on this if you want, they did a telephone survey at the time, and back then, not everybody had telephones. Only some of the more wealthy people had telephones, and guess what? They all supported Dewey. Dewey won by their spots. So bias. There are types of bias. There's what's called voluntary response. Voluntary response bias is people respond voluntarily. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. Online polls are exactly like this. CNN poll shows that, and then they give the results. And honestly, I read that and I say, no one should care what those results are because it's only based on people who responded voluntarily to something online at CNN. Despite what some people might think, CNN has a very slanted angle in how they view the world. And people who agree with CNN tend to watch CNN. So you're only going to get the response of people who watch CNN. Same thing for Fox News. You're not going to get a cross-section of the U.S. population if you look at Fox News. People say, well, what should I watch then? There isn't one. Fair and balanced. You got to look at all of them across the board, and you look at all of their surveys, and somewhere in the middle is probably the actual answer. But voluntary response is one way. Another thing is like you go to the restaurant and they have like the little survey thing. They're like, oh, fill this out for my waitress. And most people don't fill out those things unless they've had a bad experience. And they're like, oh, now I'm going to give them a piece of my mind. All right. So voluntary response tends to be very slanted or systematically favoring a certain part of the population. So that's voluntary response. I already talked about simple random sample and what that is. So that's up here, convenient sample, simple random sample. When we get to doing designed experiments, then we'll get into some others where we'll get into what is called like blocking. Okay. We will talk about other types of coverage or biases like over coverage or under coverage. All right. So when they did this, the Dewey-Truman, they over covered people who were wealthy. All right. So they got an over coverage bias in that. Response bias. This one, the name doesn't really fit, but this is where if you're asking a sensitive question where people might lie, exit polls at a polling location on election night will suffer from response bias because if right now the candidate who's polling better, if someone supports the other candidate, people are like, how can you how could you support them? Or if the other candidate is rude and obnoxious, but some people still support that particular candidate. When asked, they might not respond truthfully. And it happens an awful lot. But basically, response bias is a sensitive question is asked and people lie. Do you eat, or how about this? Do you floss twice a day? When your dentist asks you that question, how many of you tell the truth? I'm going to venture not everybody. All right, so that's what's called response bias. And I'm going to keep adding some things here as we go on. Other types of sampling techniques are, I'm going to run out of room up here, stratified. Here, I'll explain this one. And then I'll stratified. All right, stratified, you can look up how to actually spell it. And then I'll do blocking. So stratified is if you sample some people from several different strata. If you think of strata, you might think of the Earth's layers of the atmosphere and different parts of the stratosphere, troposphere, etc. as you go forward. But strata is a layer. In a high school setting, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. So you sample 5 seniors, 5 juniors, 5 sophomores, 5 freshmen. If you do that randomly, it would be a stratified random sample, okay? Or a stratified simple random sample. Then you could do cluster sampling. Cluster sampling would be every part of the population is grouped into some type of a cluster. Like in the high school, every discipleship group, you're only in one, and everybody's in one. So a cluster sample would be, I would sample, let's say 3 discipleship groups, and then I would talk to everybody in each discipleship group. Now you can see a problem with that is that, remember, discipleship groups are single gender. Well, they are this year anyways, whenever I'm recording this. And single gender means if I happen to select 3 clusters and they're all female ones, I'm only going to get a female perspective, and vice versa for males. So there's really no guaranteed way. But then what I could do is I could say, okay, now I'm going to do a blocked cluster simple random sample. So first I'm going to block. So blocking is for gender. All right. So that's a block. It's something that you just say, I'm going to separate these 2 out. So I'm going to say males and females. And then I'm going to pick 2 discipleship groups from each. And then I'm going to randomly select 2 discipleship groups from each. And then I'm going to talk to everybody in them, and that makes it a cluster. So the blocking is separating by gender. The cluster is the random part, is selecting a discipleship group. And then the fact that you ask everybody in each of those 4 discipleship groups, that makes it a cluster sample. So cluster is everybody's a part of one group and only one group. You select each of those groups and then you sample everybody in that group. And that's what's called a cluster sample. Now you're going to get a lot of consistent answers within them because males and females might have different answers. Another type of cluster could be your zip code. All right. Is there something systematically consistent about a zip code? And the answer is yes. Certain zip codes have maybe better socioeconomic status, bigger homes, smaller homes, closer to this, closer to that. So there might be something very similar about everybody in those clusters as well, which would be a type of bias, all right? Because it favors those people in that cluster. So an overcoverage possibly of someone. Something else that can go wrong here is you get what's called non-response. That is, you ask someone to be part of your survey and they say no. Nothing you can do about that. And honestly, it's a big part of doing samplings and doing surveys is there's a large percentage of people who just don't respond. If you ever mail something out and you're part of an organization that mails things out and you're like, oh, we only got like 10% return rate, that's actually not too bad. I think best case scenario, you're going to get maybe 20%. You're never going to get 100% response rate for doing like a mailed survey on anything. So that's called non-response bias. And then the last one after non-response here that we're going to do is called wording. I'm running out of room, but don't worry. Wording is just that maybe you do this do this sample and you create this question that you're going to ask. And that question is just really an awkward question. And you've read some before. Let me read an example here to you. How happy, so if you're asking someone who's a college student, these two questions, how happy are you with your life in general? And then you follow that up with, how many dates did you have last month? Person asking this question, it's such a loaded question because they're associating and they're saying, oh, you're happy because you're dating, or you're not happy because you're not dating. And people are going to be like, that's such a loaded question. Or they start by saying, did you know that landfills are increasing at record rates? How would you support banning disposable diapers and make everybody go to cloth diapers? People are like, oh, I feel so guilty because we're filling up the landfills. Of course I would support. They're probably going to lie, which is a response bias, but also the question itself is worded badly. You can't ask such a loaded question if you really want to get reliable results. And that, I think, this is just my opinion now. This is not out of the book. This is just my opinion. That's the problem with so many surveys and samples that go out there is people don't consider the words that they're using and choosing to use to think about what kind of response is that going to give me. They just think, oh, this is what I want to test for, and then they slap together some worded question that, and then they get responses going, wow, I never considered that. Oh, I never considered that. Oh, I never considered that. You need to consider all those things when making a well-designed study. A well-designed sample and survey is very difficult to do. Sampling frame. Sampling frame is it's kind of how are you going to choose your sample? From whom are you going to sample? So it's kind of framing the question. So that's your sampling frame. Just a word that you're going to come across. It's not a huge issue idea, but it's a word you might come across with. Hey, what's the sampling frame? It's who are the members of the population that we're going to be looking at. That's my sampling frame. Sampling errors, that's errors that you make in your sampling. So that could be if doing a convenient sample and the sampling errors that you make in that. Maybe you don't do a random sample. So a convenient sample, definitely not a random sample. So that would be part of, you're actually doing sampling and you're making mistakes. Making mistakes in that you're not going to get the best representative sample. So sampling errors lead to a sample that is not representative. Okay. Non-sampling errors are things that you do that aren't actually part of the sampling process, like wording. You can't do anything about that. That's a non-sampling error. Other types of non-sampling errors, that's like response bias where people lie. There's nothing about your process that's flawed when the people you ask lie. So this is more like a flawed process. This is flawed in terms of other mistakes that are going to happen that are out of your control. You can do something as a statistician to make those better. These, not always. Response bias is one of them. You can't control whether or not they're going to lie. You can control the wording, but that would unfortunately that would also fall under the non-sampling. So you can't just totally think, oh, one is in my control, the other is out of my control. For wording, that's within your control. But that's not part of the sampling process. That's part of the process of doing the whole thing, but that's another non-sampling error. And then I'm going to add this one here now, and we're going to talk about this later. Sample error is often confused with sampling errors. Sample error is very different. That means I'm going to do a sample, I'm going to collect data, and I'm going to find an average of my sample, X bar, because that's what we use for sample averages. My sample average will almost never equal the actual average of my population. But that doesn't mean what I did was wrong. It just means that this is different from this. If I do a proportion test and I say that of my 1,000 people that I sampled, 38% support someone, that's hardly ever going to equal the actual proportion of the whole population, or my parameter. All right, again, parameter, statistic. Here, I'll put a box around that. So X bar is a statistic. It's based off of a sample. P hat is a statistic. It's based off a sample, and it's a proportion. That difference between them is what's called error, because it means they're not equal. Doesn't mean wrong, just means different. So these errors mean wrong. This error means different. All right. Unfortunately, the English language uses the same word, and we use the same in statistics. I'm sorry. That's about all I got for today. Let me think. What should I have you do as a response to this? Look in the news. Look in the news and see if you can find anything of a poll that was recently taken. There's got to be something out there. Flip onto one of the news stations, preferably off of some type of media like that, not the internet. If you have to look to the internet, go to one of those news source pages, like a CNN page, or a Fox News page, or an MSNBC page, or something. See if they have recent results of polls. See what kind of information they have out there. Tell me quickly, briefly, what it was about, and then what the results were in your reflection response. That'll do it, folks. If this ended up being a longer one than normal, it's because it's a brand new program for me, checking things out. We'll see you in class.